This is HOA Neighbor Court. Let me set the scene in one breath. My name is Derek. I am a restaurant supply rep, and I live in Burlington, Vermont. I moved here 2 years ago because the job market was strong and I needed to stay close to my accounts across New England. I drive a branded van with my company logo on the side, and I park it on the street in front of my townhouse because my garage is full of inventory and repair equipment. The Heights at Summit Ridge Homeowners Association runs this neighborhood like a militarized parking lot, and the Special Assessment Coordinator, Joan Mitchell, has made it her personal mission to control every single curb space like it is her own driveway. I woke up at 3 in the morning to the beeping of a tow truck backing up in front of my house. I threw on a jacket and ran outside barefoot, and there was my van, already hooked to the wheel lift, the driver cranking the chain tight. Joan was standing on the sidewalk in a gray light jacket and a pink bucket hat, holding a flashlight and shining it at my rear plate like she was documenting evidence for a federal case. She did not even look at me when I yelled. "What are you doing?" I shouted. "That is my van. I live here." Joan turned the flashlight beam on me and said, "You are in violation of the guest parking overlay. This vehicle has been flagged for immediate removal." I said, "I am not a guest. I own this unit. I have been parking here for 2 years." She said, "The curb is HOA property under the revised parking amendment. You have been notified." I said, "I have not received any notice." She said, "Then check your portal. This vehicle is being towed under the authority of the board." The tow driver looked uncomfortable, but kept cranking. I asked him who called the tow, and he said the HOA management company gave him the authorization an hour ago. I told him I was the legal owner, I lived right there, and I had not been notified of any violation. He stopped cranking and pulled out his phone to call his dispatcher. Joan stepped closer and said, "I do not care what you think, I care what the rule says. You are not the first person I have corrected, and you will not be the last." The driver hung up and said his company had a standing contract with the HOA, and the work order came through their automated system. He said if I had proof of residency, he could release the vehicle, but I would still owe the hook fee. I ran inside, grabbed my mortgage statement and my registration, and came back out. The driver looked at the documents, looked at Joan, and said he was going to need clarification from the management company before he continued. Joan said, "You do not need clarification. The board authorized this removal. Complete the tow." The driver said, "Ma'am, if he owns the unit and the vehicle is registered here, I cannot just take it without a proper violation notice on file." Joan said, "The notice is in the system. Proceed." The driver said, "I am going to call my supervisor." While he was on the phone, I asked Joan directly who authorized the tow. She said the compliance committee reviewed the parking audit last week and flagged my van for non-compliance with the guest decal requirement. I said I was not a guest. She said any vehicle without a current resident decal was considered transient parking and subject to immediate removal under the fire lane safety protocol. I said, "This is not a fire lane." She said, "The entire street is under fire lane restrictions during overnight hours. You would know that if you attended the meetings." I said, "I have never seen that rule." She said, "Ignorance of the rules is not an excuse." The driver came back and said his supervisor told him to release the vehicle and document the dispute. He lowered my van back down, unhooked it, and handed me a hook fee invoice for $200. He said the HOA would be billed separately for the cancellation. Joan told him to submit a formal complaint against me for obstruction, and he just got in his truck and left. Joan turned to me and said, "You will receive a formal hearing notice within 72 hours. If you continue to park in violation, the next tow will not be interrupted." I said, "You cannot tow a resident for parking legally on a public street." She said, "The street is private property under the subdivision plat. Read your CCRs." She walked away before I could respond. I stood there in my bare feet holding a hook fee bill and a mortgage statement, and I realized I was dealing with someone who had decided the rules were whatever she said they were. I went inside and pulled up the HOA portal on my laptop. There was nothing in my inbox. No violation notices. No hearing invitations. No emails. I checked my spam folder. Nothing. I went to the documents section and found the parking policy. It had been updated 3 weeks ago with a new amendment titled Fire Lane and Guest Vehicle Compliance Overlay. The amendment said any vehicle parked on the street overnight without a visible resident decal would be subject to immediate removal as a fire hazard. The problem was, I had never been told about resident decals. I had been parking my van in the same spot for 2 years, and no one had ever said anything. I scrolled through the amendment and saw that the board had voted to implement the new rule with a 60-day grace period, but the grace period had ended 2 weeks ago. I checked my email again and searched for any communication from the HOA. The only message I found was a generic newsletter from 6 months ago, welcoming new residents, and reminding everyone to update their contact information in the portal. I called the management company the next morning. The receptionist transferred me to the compliance department, and a woman named Lisa told me she could not discuss active enforcement actions over the phone. I said I needed to know why I was not notified about the parking rule change. She said all residents were notified by email and by posting on the community bulletin board. I said I never received an email. She said the emails went to the address on file in the portal. I asked her what address that was, and she read back an old email address I had stopped using a year ago. I said, I updated my contact information in the portal 8 months ago. She said, the update did not sync with our system. You will need to contact the webmaster. I said, who is the webmaster? She said, that would be the board secretary. I said, can you give me the board secretary's contact information? She said, all board communication goes through the management company. I said, so I am supposed to contact you to contact the board secretary to fix my email, so I can receive notices about rules I have already been fined for. She said, I can submit a ticket. I hung up and sent an email directly to the management company with my current contact information, a copy of my mortgage statement, a copy of my vehicle registration, and a formal request for copies of all violation notices issued to my address. I also asked for a copy of the meeting minutes where the parking amendment was approved and a list of all residents who had been issued decals under the new system. That afternoon, I got a reply from Lisa saying my request had been forwarded to the compliance committee and I should expect a response within 10 business days. I replied and said I needed the information before my hearing, which was supposed to happen within 72 hours. She replied and said the hearing schedule was managed by the board and she could not provide dates or times. I drove to the HOA management office in person. It was in a small office park outside of town, and the front desk was staffed by a teenager who looked like he would rather be anywhere else. I asked to speak to someone in compliance. He said everyone was in a meeting. I said I would wait. He said the meeting was off-site and no one would be back until tomorrow. I asked if he could at least confirm that my email address had been updated in the system. He said he did not have access to the resident database. I asked if he could print out a copy of the parking amendment. He said the documents were password protected and he did not have the password. I left and went to the public library to print out the parking amendment myself. I also printed out the original CCRs, the subdivision plat, and the state statute on private streets and HOA enforcement authority. I was not a lawyer, but I knew how to read contracts, and I was pretty sure the HOA could not just declare a public street private without going through the city. I called the city zoning office and asked if the Heights at Summit Ridge had any recorded private street designations. The clerk said she would have to check the plat maps and call me back. She called me back an hour later and said the streets in the subdivision were dedicated public rights-of-way and maintained by the city. I asked if that meant the HOA could not restrict parking on the street. She said the HOA could request parking restrictions through the city council, but any restriction would have to be posted with official signage and enforced by the city, not by a private tow company. I asked if there were any fire lane restrictions on my street. She said there were no recorded fire lanes in the subdivision, except for the area directly in front of the clubhouse. I thanked her and hung up. I now had proof that Joan was lying about the street being HOA property and lying about the fire lane restrictions. The problem was, I still had a hearing coming up, and no idea when or where it was going to happen. 2 days later, I came home from work and found a red stamped final notice envelope in my mailbox. Inside was a single sheet of paper with the HOA logo at the top and the words "Compliance Hearing Notice" in bold. The hearing was scheduled for that evening at 7 at the clubhouse. The notice said I was required to appear to address multiple parking violations and failure to comply with the resident decal requirement. It said if I failed to appear, the board would proceed with enforcement action including fines, liens, and additional towing. The notice was dated 5 days ago. I checked the postmark on the envelope. It had been mailed the day before and marked with a bulk rate stamp. Someone had backdated the notice and mailed it at the last possible second, so I would have no time to prepare. I called my neighbor Mike, who had caught Joan on his doorbell camera a few weeks ago walking around the neighborhood at night with a clipboard. Mike was a landscaping contractor who worked long hours and kept to himself, but he had mentioned the footage to me in passing after he saw Joan marking cars with chalk. I asked him if he still had the video. He said he kept everything for 90 days. I asked if I could come over and grab a copy. He said sure, and he would burn it to a thumb drive. I went over to his place, and he showed me the footage. It was Joan, clear as day, walking down the street at 2 in the morning with a flashlight and a clipboard, stopping at every car and writing down plate numbers. In one clip, she leaned down and stuck something on a windshield. Mike said he had also caught her measuring distances from the curb with a tape measure. I asked him if he would be willing to testify at the hearing. He said he did not want to get involved, but he would give me the footage, and I could do what I wanted with it. I thanked him and took the thumb drive. I spent the rest of the afternoon putting together a binder with printed copies of the city zoning confirmation, the parking amendment, the original CCRs, the doorbell footage screenshots, and a timeline of every interaction I had with Joan and the management company. I also printed out the hook fee invoice from the tow company and a receipt showing I had paid it under protest. At 7, I walked into the clubhouse. The board was already seated at a table in the front of the room. Joan was sitting in the middle, flanked by 2 other board members I had never met. There were about a dozen residents in the audience, most of them looking bored or annoyed. Joan saw me come in and made a note on her clipboard. The board president, a man in his 60s with a gray beard, called the meeting to order and said they were going to address compliance issues first. He read my name and said I was being charged with 3 counts of overnight parking without a resident decal, 1 count of obstructing an authorized tow, and 1 count of failure to update contact information in the portal. I raised my hand and said I had not been notified of any violations prior to the tow attempt. Joan said, "You were notified by email on the date the amendment was approved." I said, "I never received that email because the management company had the wrong address on file." Joan said, "It is your responsibility to maintain accurate contact information." I said, "I updated my information 8 months ago, and the system did not sync." Joan said, "That is not the board's problem." I said, "It is the board's problem if you are enforcing rules without proper notice." The board president said, "We are not here to debate procedure. We are here to address your non-compliance." I said, "I am in compliance. I am a resident. I own my unit. I am parked on a public street that the city confirmed is not under HOA control." Joan said, "The street is private property under the subdivision plat." I said, "I have a letter from the city zoning office that says otherwise." I pulled out the letter and handed it to the board president. He read it, frowned, and passed it to Joan. She glanced at it and said, "This is irrelevant. The HOA has the authority to regulate parking under the CCRs." I said, "The CCRs do not give the HOA the authority to override city jurisdiction." Joan said, "The board voted to implement the fire lane overlay as a safety measure." I said, "There is no fire lane on my street. The city confirmed that as well." Joan said, "The fire lane designation is internal to the HOA." I said, "You cannot invent fire lanes and use them to tow residents without proper signage and city approval." The board president said, "We will take your documentation under advisement. In the meantime, you are still required to obtain a resident decal and display it on your vehicle." I said, "Fine. Where do I get a decal?" Joan said, "You submit a request through the portal and the compliance committee will review it." I said, "How long does that take?" Joan said, "Up to 30 days. I said, "So I am supposed to not park on the street for 30 days while you decide whether to give me a decal that I should have been given 2 years ago?" Joan said, "You are supposed to comply with the rules." I said, "I am happy to comply with the rules if you follow the law." Joan said, "I do not care what you think. I care what the rule says." The board president said they would take a short recess and deliberate. I sat down in the audience and waited. One of the other residents leaned over and whispered that Joan had been pulling this routine with half the neighborhood for the past 6 months. He said she had a quota for fines and was using the decal program to shake people down. I asked if anyone had challenged her. He said one guy had hired a lawyer and the board backed down immediately, but most people just paid the fines because it was easier than fighting. After 10 minutes, the board came back and the president said they had decided to table the enforcement action pending further review of the city zoning documentation. He said I would still need to obtain a resident decal within 14 days or face additional fines. Joan looked furious, but did not say anything. I asked how I was supposed to display a decal I had not been given. The president said I could submit a request through the portal and they would expedite it. I said I wanted a decal issued tonight. Joan said that was not possible. I said then I wanted a written confirmation that I would not be towed while waiting for the decal. The president said he would email me a temporary waiver. I left the meeting and sat in my van in the parking lot, waiting to see if the email came through. It did not. I drove home and checked my email every hour for the rest of the night. Nothing. The next morning, I woke up to another red-stamped final notice envelope in my mailbox. This one said I had been fined $500 for obstruction of an authorized tow and failure to comply with a board directive. The notice said I had 10 days to pay, or the fine would be added to my account and subject to a lien. I called the management company and asked to speak to Lisa. She was not available. I asked to speak to anyone in compliance. The receptionist said everyone was in meetings. I said I would hold. She put me on hold for 20 minutes and then disconnected the call. I called back and asked for the regional supervisor. The receptionist said the regional supervisor did not take calls from residents. I said I needed to file a formal complaint. She said I could submit a complaint through the portal. I said the portal was not working. She said she would submit a ticket. I hung up and sent an email to the regional supervisor directly, using the contact information I found on the management company's website. I explained the entire situation, attached all my documentation, and said I believed Joan was exceeding her authority and violating state HOA regulations. I also said I was planning to file a state procedure complaint if the issue was not resolved within 7 days. 2 hours later, I got a call from a man who identified himself as the regional supervisor, Paul. He said he had reviewed my email and the compliance file, and he agreed there were some procedural issues that needed to be addressed. He said Joan had been operating under the assumption that the board had granted her full enforcement authority, but the management company had never formally authorized her to order tows without individual board approval. If you are enjoying this story, please hit the like button and subscribe for more HOA nightmares. I said, "So she has been ordering tows without authorization?" Paul said, "That is correct. The tow company has a contract with the HOA, but the contract requires a signed work order from the management company for each removal. Joan has been submitting work orders using a digital signature that was supposed to be restricted to the board president." I said, "That sounds like fraud." Paul said, "It is a compliance issue that we are addressing internally." I said, "What about the fines and the backdated notices?" Paul said, "We are going to suspend all enforcement actions related to your account pending a full audit of the compliance program. You will receive a written confirmation by the end of the day." I said, "What about the $500 fine?" Paul said, The fine will be reversed and removed from your account. I said, what about the hook fee I paid? Paul said, that is between you and the tow company. We cannot refund fees paid to third-party vendors. I said, Joan told the tow company to proceed even after I showed proof of residency. That is on the HOA. Paul said, we will review the incident report and follow up with the vendor. I said, I want a resident decal issued today. Paul said, I will have one couriered to your address by tomorrow morning. I thanked him and hung up. I felt like I had just won a small battle, but I knew Joan was not going to let this go. That night, I got a knock on my door. I opened it and found a man in a polo shirt with a vendor badge clipped to his belt. He said he was from the HOA's parking compliance contractor, and he was there to verify my vehicle registration and decal eligibility. I said I had already been cleared by the management company, and I was waiting for my decal to be delivered. He said he still needed to complete the verification as part of the compliance audit. I asked him who sent him. He said Joan had submitted the work order that afternoon. I said Joan did not have the authority to send vendors to my door. He said he was just doing his job, and if I refused to cooperate, he would have to file a non-compliance report. I said, file whatever you want. I am not answering questions without documentation from the management company. He said, I can wait while you call them. I said, I am not calling them. You can leave. He stood there for a minute like he was trying to decide what to do. Then he pulled out his phone and took a picture of my front door. I stepped outside and said, what are you doing? He said, documenting the visit. I said, you are on my property without permission. Leave now or I am calling the police. He walked back to his truck and drove off. I went inside and immediately called Paul. He did not answer, so I left a voicemail explaining what had just happened. I also sent him an email with the vendor's name and badge number. Paul called me back 10 minutes later and said he had just spoken with Joan, and she claimed the vendor visit was part of a routine audit that had been scheduled weeks ago. I said that was a lie, and the vendor had explicitly told me Joan sent him that afternoon. Paul said he would look into it and get back to me. I did not hear from him again that night. The next morning, I found my resident decal taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve. There was no note, no instructions, just the decal. I peeled it off and stuck it on my windshield, and I thought maybe that would be the end of it. It was not. That afternoon, I came home and found a tow truck parked in front of my house with my van already hooked to the wheel lift. I ran outside and yelled, and the driver turned and held up a work order. He said the HOA had flagged my vehicle for removal due to an expired decal. I said, I just put the decal on this morning. He said, the work order says the decal is invalid. I said, who issued the work order? He said, the HOA compliance office. I pulled out my phone and called Paul. He answered on the second ring and I told him what was happening. He said he had not authorized any tows, and he would call the vendor immediately. He told me to put the driver on the phone. I handed the driver my phone. He listened for a minute, then handed it back and said, I am going to need to call my dispatch. He got on his radio, and I heard him say something about conflicting authorization. A few seconds later, he unhooked my van and said, this is getting sorted out above my pay grade. I am leaving. I thanked him and he drove off. I called Paul back and he said he had just confirmed that Joan had submitted another work order using the digital signature, even though her access had been revoked the day before. He said the management company was terminating her authority to submit any work orders effective immediately, and the board president was being notified. I said, this is harassment. Paul said, I understand your frustration. We are taking steps to address it. I said, I want a written statement confirming that Joan is not authorized to order tows, and I want it sent to the tow company and posted in the HOA portal. Paul said, I will make sure that happens. I hung up and stood in my driveway, staring at the decal on my windshield. I realized Joan was not going to stop until someone forced her to stop, and the management company was not going to do it. They were just going to keep apologizing and reversing fines and hoping I would go away. That night, I got a call from Mike, my neighbor with the doorbell camera. He said Joan had just been at his door, asking him to sign a statement saying he had never provided me with any video footage. He said he told her he was not signing anything, and she said if he refused to cooperate, he would be added to the compliance audit. He said he wanted to give me a heads up that she was going around the neighborhood trying to intimidate anyone who might have helped me. I thanked him and said I appreciated the warning. He said, "For what it is worth, you are doing the right thing. Someone needs to stand up to her." I said, "I am trying, but she keeps escalating." He said, "She has been doing this for years. She got elected to the board by promising to crack down on property values, and now she uses compliance as a weapon. Half the neighborhood is afraid of her." I said, "Why does not anyone vote her out?" He said, "She controls the nominating committee. She only lets people run if they agree with her agenda." I hung up and realized I was dealing with someone who had built a system to protect herself. The only way to stop her was to break the system. The next day, I filed a state procedure complaint with the Vermont Attorney General's office. The complaint form asked for detailed documentation of the HOA's violations, so I attached everything I had: the city zoning letter, the doorbell footage, the timeline of notices and fines, the hook fee invoice, the emails from Paul, and a sworn statement describing Joan's pattern of harassment and unauthorized tow orders. I also requested a formal investigation into the HOA's use of digital signatures and whether Joan had committed fraud by submitting work orders without authority. The complaint form said I should expect a response within 30 days, but the state could take longer depending on the complexity of the case. I submitted it and felt a small sense of relief, but I knew Joan was not going to wait 30 days to retaliate. 2 days later, I got another red-stamped final notice envelope. This one said I was required to attend an emergency compliance hearing that evening at 6. The notice said the board had received a complaint from a vendor alleging that I had threatened him and refused to cooperate with a lawful audit. It said the hearing would determine whether I should be fined for obstruction and harassment. I called Paul immediately. He said he had not been notified of any emergency hearing, and he would contact the board president to find out what was going on. He called me back 20 minutes later and said the hearing had been scheduled by Joan without board approval. He said the board president was furious and had canceled the hearing. I said, "She is out of control." Paul said, "I agree. The board is meeting tonight to discuss removing her from the compliance committee." I said, "Good. But I am not holding my breath." Paul said, "I understand. In the meantime, if she contacts you directly, do not engage. Document everything and forward it to me." I thanked him and hung up. I felt like I was living in a nightmare where the rules kept changing and no one could stop the person making them up. That evening, I was sitting in my living room when I heard a car pull up outside. I looked out the window and saw Joan standing on the sidewalk in front of my house, holding her flashlight and shining it at my van. I grabbed my phone and started recording. She walked around the van slowly, taking pictures of the decal, the plate, and the curb. Then, she pulled out a roll of warning stickers and started peeling one off. I opened my front door and yelled, "What are you doing?" She turned and said, "Documenting non-compliance." I said, "I have a valid decal. You can see it right there." She said, "The decal was issued in error. This vehicle is not in compliance with the weight restriction overlay." I said, "What weight restriction overlay?" She said, "Commercial vehicles over 8,000 pounds are prohibited from overnight parking under the revised fire lane protocol." I said, "My van is not over 8,000 pounds, and there is no fire lane on this street." She said, "That is not for you to determine." I said, "You are harassing me." She said, "I am enforcing the rules. You are not the first person I have corrected, and you will not be the last." I said, "The management company revoked your authority to issue violations. You are not allowed to be here." She said, "The board has not revoked my authority. I am acting under my role as special assessment coordinator." I said, "You do not have any authority over parking enforcement." Paul confirmed that. She said, "Paul does not speak for the board." I said, "The board president canceled your hearing tonight because you scheduled it without approval." She said, "That is an internal matter." I said, "You need to leave my property." She said, "I am on the sidewalk. This is HOA property." I said, "The sidewalk is city property. Leave now or I am calling the police." She stuck the warning sticker on my windshield, right over the decal, and walked back to her car. I kept recording until she drove away, then I went inside and forwarded the video to Paul with a subject line that said, "This needs to stop now." Paul called me 5 minutes later and said he had just watched the video, and he was escalating the issue to the corporate legal team. He said Joan was clearly violating the management company's directives, and they were going to recommend that the board remove her from all enforcement roles immediately. I said, "What about the sticker she just put on my van?" Paul said, "Remove it. It has no legal standing." I said, "What if she orders another tow?" Paul said, "We have notified the tow company that any work order from Joan is invalid. If they show up again, call me immediately, and I will handle it directly." I thanked him and hung up. I went outside and peeled the warning sticker off my windshield. The adhesive left a residue that I had to scrape off with a credit card. I stood there in the dark, staring at the decal, and I realized I was done playing defense. Joan had crossed the line, and I had everything I needed to bury her. The next morning, I called the tow company and asked to speak to the owner. I told him I wanted copies of all the work orders Joan had submitted over the past 6 months, along with the authorization signatures and payment records. He said he could not release that information without a subpoena. I said I was not asking for a subpoena. I was asking him to review his own records and confirm whether the work orders were properly authorized. He said he would look into it and call me back. 2 hours later, he called and said he had just spoken with his attorney, and they had determined that several of the work orders Joan had submitted were missing proper board approval. He said the company was suspending all future work orders from the HOA until they received written confirmation that the authorization process had been corrected. I said, "So you are not going to tow anyone else based on Joan's orders?" He said, "Correct. We are also reviewing whether we want to continue the contract at all." This has turned into a liability issue. I thanked him and hung up. I immediately sent an email to Paul with a summary of the conversation and a request that the management company provide written confirmation to the tow vendor that Joan was not authorized to submit work orders. Paul replied within an hour and said the confirmation letter had been sent and the board president was scheduling an emergency board meeting to address Joan's conduct. That night, I got a call from a number I did not recognize. I answered and a woman said, "Is this Derek?" I said, "Yes." She said, "My name is Angela. I am a former board member at the Heights at Summit Ridge. I heard you filed a state complaint against Joan Mitchell." I said, "How did you hear that?" She said, "I still have friends on the board. They are panicking because they know what she has been doing, and they do not want to be liable." I said, "What has she been doing?" She said, "Joan has been running a side business with the tow company. Every time she orders a tow, she gets a kickback from the vendor. She has been doing it for 2 years, and the board has been looking the other way because she brings in revenue from fines and enforcement fees." I said, "That is illegal." She said, "That is why I am calling you. I have documentation. I have emails, payment records, and meeting minutes that show the board knew about the arrangement and approved it under the table. I was pushed off the board when I tried to report it to the management company." I said, "Why are you telling me this now?" She said, "Because you are the first person who has had the guts to fight back, and I want to see her taken down. I also want to make sure the board does not scapegoat her and pretend they did not know." I said, "Can I get copies of the documentation?" She said, "I can meet you tonight. I am flying out tomorrow for work, and I will not be back for 2 weeks. If you want this, It has to be tonight. I said, "Where?" She said, "There is a gas station at the edge of the subdivision, near the main entrance. Meet me there at 9. I agreed and hung up. I let her think I was cornered, because my trump card needed her to overreach. At 9, I drove to the gas station and parked under the lights. Angela pulled up a few minutes later in a sedan and got out holding a manila folder. She handed it to me through the window and said, "Everything you need is in there. Emails, invoices, meeting minutes, and a signed affidavit from me describing the kickback arrangement. I also included a list of other residents who were targeted the same way you were." I said, "Why did you keep all this?" She said, "Because I knew someone would eventually need it. Joan is a bully, and bullies always go too far." I thanked her, and she got back in her car and drove off. I sat there for a minute, flipping through the folder. The documentation was even better than I expected. There were emails between Joan and the tow company owner discussing referral fees. There were invoices showing payments made to Joan's personal LLC. There were meeting minutes where the board discussed enforcement revenue targets and approved Joan's proposal to increase towing frequency. There was also a handwritten note from the board president to Joan that said, "Keep doing what you are doing. We need the numbers." I drove home and scanned every page into my computer. I uploaded copies to a secure cloud account, burned a backup to a thumb drive, and mailed a copy to my attorney with instructions to hold it in escrow. The next morning, I forwarded the entire packet to Paul with a subject line that said, "You need to see this immediately." Paul called me 10 minutes later and said, "Where did you get this?" I said, "A former board member who was pushed out for trying to report it." Paul said, "This is fraud. This is racketeering. This is going to blow up the entire board." I said, "Good. They deserve it." Paul said, "I need to take this to corporate legal right now. Do not share this with anyone else until we determine next steps." I said, "I already sent copies to my attorney and filed a supplemental complaint with the state." Paul was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You are going to destroy this HOA." I said, "I am going to stop Joan. If the board goes down with her, that is their problem." Paul said, "The management company is going to terminate the contract. We cannot be associated with this." I said, "Then do it. But first, make sure Joan is removed from the board and banned from any enforcement rule." Paul said, "That is going to happen today." I hung up and waited. That afternoon, I got an email from the board president with a formal notice that Joan Mitchell had been removed from the compliance committee and suspended from all board duties pending an internal investigation. The email also said the board was conducting a full audit of enforcement actions over the past 2 years, and any improperly issued fines would be reversed. I replied and asked if the board planned to address the kickback arrangement with the tow company. The board president did not respond. 2 days later, I got a call from a detective with the Burlington Police Department. He said the state attorney general's office had forwarded my complaint to local law enforcement and they were opening an investigation into possible fraud and embezzlement. He asked if I would be willing to provide a formal statement and copies of the documentation I had submitted. I said, "Absolutely." He said, "We are also going to need to interview the former board member who provided the records." I said, "Her name is Angela. I have her contact information." He took down the details and said someone would be in touch to schedule the interview. 3 days later, Joan showed up at my house again. This time, she did not have a flashlight or a clipboard. She was just standing on the sidewalk, staring at my van. I opened the door and said, "You need to leave." She turned and looked at me and said, "You think you have won?" I said, "I think you are under investigation for fraud." She said, "You do not have any proof." I said, "I have emails, invoices, meeting minutes, and a signed affidavit from a former board member. I also have doorbell footage of you harassing me and ordering tows without authorization." She said, "None of that will hold up." I said, "The police seem to think it will." She said, "You are going to regret this. I said, "The only person who is going to regret anything is you." She walked back to her car and drove off. I went inside and called the detective. He said they were aware that Joan had been contacting witnesses and they were going to issue a warning for her to stop. A week later, I got a notice in the mail that the board had scheduled a special meeting to address the compliance audit and discuss potential legal action against Joan and the tow company. The meeting was open to all residents, and I made sure to be there. The clubhouse was packed. People were standing in the back because there were not enough chairs. The board president opened the meeting and said they had completed the audit and determined that over 200 violations had been issued improperly over the past 2 years. He said the board was reversing all fines and issuing refunds to affected residents. He also said the board had terminated the contract with the tow company and was pursuing legal action to recover kickback payments. Someone in the audience asked what was going to happen to Joan. The board president said Joan had resigned from the board and was no longer involved in any HOA activities. He said the board could not comment on the criminal investigation, but they were cooperating fully with law enforcement. Another resident asked if the board was going to resign. The board president said the board was committed to rebuilding trust with the community and implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. Someone yelled, "You knew what she was doing, and you let it happen." The board president said, "We made mistakes, and we are taking responsibility." The room erupted in shouting. People were demanding resignations, refunds, and apologies. The board president tried to restore order, but it was chaos. I stood up and said, "I have a question." The room went quiet. I said, "The documentation I provided to the state shows that the board approved Joan's enforcement strategy and discussed revenue targets and closed meetings. Are you saying you did not know she was getting kickbacks, or are you saying you knew and did not care?" The board president said, "We were not aware of any financial arrangement between Joan and the tow company." I said, "Then why do the meeting minutes from last year show you discussing enforcement revenue and telling Joan to increase towing frequency?" The board president said, "That is taken out of context." I said the context is pretty clear. You wanted the money and you did not care how she got it. Someone in the audience yelled, "Recall them all." The board president said, "This meeting is adjourned." He stood up and walked out, followed by the other board members. The room was still shouting as they left. A week later, I got a call from the detective. He said they had completed the initial investigation and they were filing charges against Joan for theft by deception and abuse of authority. He said the tow company owner was also being charged as a co-conspirator. He said the board members were not being charged, but the state was requiring the HOA to implement independent oversight and report any future enforcement actions to the Attorney General's office for review. I asked what was going to happen to Joan. He said she was facing up to 5 years in prison and restitution to the HOA and affected residents. He said the case would probably be resolved with a plea deal, but it was too early to say. I thanked him and hung up. 2 weeks later, I got a letter from the HOA attorney saying the board had voted to settle my complaint by refunding all fines, reimbursing my hook fee, and issuing a formal apology. The letter also said the HOA was implementing new policies to ensure proper notice and due process in all enforcement actions. I accepted the settlement and filed it with the state to close my complaint. A month later, the tow company terminated its contract with the HOA and issued a public statement saying they were blacklisting the association due to fraud and misrepresentation. The statement said they would not do business with any HOA that failed to maintain proper authorization procedures. The board had to scramble to find a new tow vendor, and the only company willing to take the contract charged double the previous rate. 3 months later, Joan pleaded guilty to theft by deception and was sentenced to 2 years of probation, community service, and restitution. The judge also banned her from holding any position of authority in an HOA for 10 years. The board president resigned a week later, along with 2 other board members. A recall election was held, and a slate of reform candidates won every seat. The new board voted to freeze all enforcement actions pending a complete rewrite of the parking policy and compliance procedures. They also hired an independent management company to oversee enforcement and ensure residents were properly notified of any rule changes. I never got another red-stamped final notice envelope in my mailbox. One night, about 6 months after everything had settled, I was sitting in my living room when I got a call from Mike. He said, "Did you hear?" I said, "Hear what?" He said, "Joan is moving out. She sold her house, and she is leaving the state." I said, "Good riddance." He said, "You did it. You actually did it." I said, "We did it. You gave me the footage that started the whole thing." He said, "I just handed you a thumb drive. You took her down." I said, "She took herself down. I just made sure everyone saw it." He laughed and said, "Well, thanks for making the neighborhood livable again." I hung up and looked out the window at my van, parked on the street with the resident decal still stuck to the windshield. I thought about the night Joan tried to tow it, the night I stood barefoot on the sidewalk and realized I was going to have to fight. I thought about the moment I played the clip out loud in the meeting so Karen could not talk over it. The moment Angela handed me the folder at the gas station. The moment the detective told me they were filing charges. I thought about Joan claiming she never came by, and the doorbell video that played and proved she was lying. I thought about the warning stickers and the backdated notices and the staged photos she tried to use against me that ended up being used against her instead. I thought about the HOA freezing enforcement pending a policy rewrite, the tow company blacklisting the association, and Joan moving out of state with a criminal record. I thought about all of it, and I realized I had won. Not because I was smarter or tougher or angrier, but because I refused to let her make the rules. Thanks for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.